The History Things podcast is brought to you by TR Historical, your one-stop shop for all your historical fan gear needs. Visit trhistorical.com and use the promo code HISTORYTHINGS to receive 10% off your next purchase. Thanks for listening. Now let's start the show.
Are you ready?
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the History Things podcast. I am your host, Pat McGuire. Joining me today is my ever-ready co-host, always ready with the passion, the knowledge, the energy, Mr. Matt Borders. How you doing today, buddy?
Doing great, bud. How's everything with you?
Oh, man, you know, we're living in the interesting times still. This is probably our third installment we've done via the Zoom and the Skype. So I'm starting to settle into a groove. I'm starting to settle into a groove, but I'm also over it. But doing the Zoom thing has allowed us to do some pretty cool stuff, allowed us to explore some cool connections to history in ways that we're not, used to doing. So that brings us to tonight. We got a really cool topic. We're going to talk about connecting you to history through music. And tonight's edition is going to be on rock and roll. In order to help us do that, we brought a very good friend of ours along from Civil War, Pittsburgh. He's also from Pennsylvania in the Civil War, and he's got a really cool band we're going to ask him about. Ladies and gentlemen, our very good buddy, Mr. Rich Condon. How you doing, man?
I'm doing pretty well. How about yourself?
Doing great, man. Thanks for asking. It's like we were saying, dude, we're living in some interesting worlds. How's the life going on in South Carolina down there, man?
It's a lot different from Pittsburgh. It's a lot sunnier. I think right after I left Western Pennsylvania 2 weeks ago, it started snowing. And I haven't had a single day of rain since I've been here. Yeah, it's pretty great.
Have you found any connections? Have you found any connections to Pittsburgh and South Carolina yet in terms of Civil War?
That's all I do every day.
All you do is just connect it. You're like, here, Civil War, Pittsburgh and South Carolina.
I think before I took the job down here with Reconstruction Era National Historical Park, I looked for several different connections between Western Pennsylvania and Beaufort/Port Royal, and that really kind of solidified my decision with taking the job.
Okay. You're like, I got material down there.
Exactly, yeah, and
Nice.
I've already kind of worked some of that material in the last week or so. And we'll continue doing that here.
How many sites is this for you now? How many green and gray positions?
This is my second one, actually.
Okay.
For the last 2 years, I was at Flight 93 National Memorial.
Right.
And before that, I've worked in the field of public history for the better part of a decade, mostly private sector places, yeah.
Nice. Very cool. Well, we're glad to have you back in the green and gray. My season's about to get started here shortly, too. So
that's exciting. That's good to know, too, because there are some people out there who aren't as fortunate as us.
Right.
With the current situation going on.
Most
Very
definitely.
cool, man. Well, real quick before we get into tonight's topic, we don't just have you here because of your awesome area of expertise as a historian. You, Mr. Rich, like myself, have a sort of another life, another gig, if you will, in the musical world. As a lot of you know, with myself, History Things with Pat, I came up in a couple metal bands, Lysergic Cross and Old Malley back in the day. But right now, you're involved in a really cool project, a lot of cool ethereal textures. Why don't you go ahead and tell our listeners a little bit about Surf Camp, man?
Sure. Now we have the colliding of two worlds, which is the first for this. But yeah, so I've played music since I was 12 years old. I've been playing music as long as I've been studying history. So they've always been kind of like, fighting for me, these two different worlds. And before I was doing history professionally, which actually started in Middle Tennessee. My first job was for the Battle of Franklin Trust. I was a battlefield guide on Franklin Battlefield.
I just visited there for the first time last summer. That was awesome.
It's pretty amazing, and it's a lot different from how it was when I was there. As far as preservation goes, they've recovered a lot of battlefield land in a community that keeps expanding. But anyway, I moved to Nashville because I was a session musician. So I was kind of a gun for hire, and I played for a bunch of different people and, toured quite a bit. I was with a band that used to tour through the Carolinas quite a bit. And we would go through Columbia, which is maybe, I think, 45 minutes west of where I am now. Over time, I just kept doing that. And then I got the job with the Battle of Franklin Trust, and then playing music professionally kind of took a back seat. And then I pursued my career in public history. But Surf Camp, the band that project that I'm involved with now, is something that started a little over a year ago. I guess it was late 2018, early 2019. And it's really stemmed from, growing up in Western Pennsylvania. If anyone has ever spent fall, winter season in Western PA, October to April, it's overcast, it's cloudy, it's depressing. You don't want to leave. I mean, I'm obviously very pale because I grew up in that area. It comes with territory. And me and my really good friend, Dylan White, who actually moved with me to Nashville back in 2000, I guess it was 2010. We started this new project. We wanted to do something. We wanted to play music that kind of, I guess, had this feeling of kind of I guess it was like uplifting music. It was very Brian Wilson, Beach Boys influenced. But the lyrics are definitely heavily influenced by life in Western Pennsylvania and kind of idealizing life outside of Western Pennsylvania, going to the beach and stuff like that. We have one song out on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you can find music, called Something Else. But as far as the rest of the music goes, we are yet to release the EP, which we've been working on for the last couple of months before I moved to South Carolina. But I think if all goes well, we should be releasing that probably toward the end of summer. And it's more of a passion project. We don't plan on making money off of it or anything like that. It's just something we like to do, and we both work really well when it comes to writing music, and it's just something we're going to continue doing just for fun.
My brother and I are living that same life right now, so that's awesome. That's exactly why we brought you here tonight, man. Great.
Yeah, it's like therapy. I think when I lived in Frederick for, I think it was like 9 months to a year, I didn't play music at all that entire time, and I just remember being kind of bummed out because I didn't have that artistic outlet. And then, relocating back to Pittsburgh in early 2018, I started playing music again, and I just remember feeling instantly better. So that's why I think it's something I'll probably never stop doing.
Cheaper than therapy too.
It's a lot cheaper than actual therapy.
All right, man. So let's kick things off, man. I want to get people into your band. I want to get people into sort of like what makes you you, and music is a lot of what makes me. And I know that's probably the same for you. And as a historian, I'm sure you can find places that you connect with history all over the place. So what we asked you to do is sort of to pick out, a couple songs or a few songs that sort of just connect you to history in different ways, whether it's something that brought you into history, when you were a kid, or something that connects you all the way up through today in contemporary time. So Rich, why don't you kick us off here with the first song that connects you, that you like, that connects you to history in a way. Give us your first take here, buddy.
So the first song that I picked is from a band that actually one of the first albums I ever bought with my own money was an album called So Long and Thanks for All the Shoes. And it was No Effects. And you wouldn't think of No Effects when you're trying to picture a band that writes about some historical point in history, or some point in history. But they are a very political band, and they're kind of like a jokey band, for anyone that's familiar with them. And The song that I picked is actually off an album called The War on Errorism. And it came out in 2003. And the song's called Franco Un-American. Franco Un-American is if you ever look at the album, and it's kind of explained in just the album art. You see a picture of, they have the American flag backdrop, like very cartoonish, and then a picture of, or a cartoon of George W. Bush with clown makeup on. And so you kind of get the idea that NoFX really aren't supporters of the George W. Bush administration. The album came out at the just as the war out in the Middle East was getting underway. They weren't supporters of the war. This came out, 2 years after the 9/11 attacks, and it really shows how a portion or a segment of the punk community was really kind of pushing back against this administration and what does this war mean in the Middle East, and why are we sending all these young people over there? Obviously, Osama bin Laden wasn't killed until 2011, 10 years after the attacks. But this album and that song in particular kind of underlined what we're doing here on the home front, and why are we doing what we're doing overseas. And that, I don't think it really came to a full understanding until years later, but that's just how people in that community were feeling at the time in 2003.
If I remember right, we had a System of a Down, Rage Against the Machine, Green Day. All those bands were doing very similar. A theme isn't quite the right term. As a non-music guy, though, that's what I got to go with. There was a lot of pushback in music, particularly in rock, in the early 2000s era.
Absolutely. I think that tone is a good word. I think there was a lot of angry tone in the music for sure.
I mean, those bands and NoFX in particular kind of channeled, the various voices of, youthful Americans and how they felt about what we're doing in the Middle East. And kind of with the events of September 11th and, fresh memory, they're writing these songs. I think they started writing that album, The War on Errorism, in 2001 or maybe even 2000. So after September 11th happened, that kind of just, tossed some fuel in the fire. And they get the album out less than 2 years afterward. And there's a music video. I don't know if you want to show that at all. It's pretty interesting.
I remember that time pretty vividly. I was a junior and senior in high school when the war broke out, when the second Gulf War broke out. And so my generation was turning 18 right as we were going to war again. And that was one of those things that was super surreal because I didn't know how I felt about it. I hadn't learned all the things I learned about service and history and just politics and all the stuff that I know now. And I just remember at the time I felt a lot of anger, and I was definitely not, for the war, regardless of, the attacks that had just happened. I was very angry about the attacks. And I remember it was just one of these very conflicted times, and music was somewhere I went. And the punk scene, the skater punk scene, because I love Pennywise. And we had mentioned that in the pre-show, and Pennywise touches on this subject a lot too. So I love NoFX's take on this subject matter, and I think it's a great pick, man.
And it's kind of interesting, and I appreciate that. It's kind of interesting to look back. As I'd mentioned, I worked at Flight 93 National Memorial for 2 seasons. One thing that I would find myself doing fairly often was kind of going back and, I remember what I was doing on September 11, 2001.
Sure.
But it kind of puts it into perspective when you see what albums came out at that time. For example, The Strokes' Is This It?, their debut album, which is one of my favorite albums of all time, came out just before the attacks on September 11th. You had what was the debut album from Coldplay? And I'm ashamed to admit this, but
you listen to Coldplay.
Don't judge. But the debut album from Coldplay came out around that same time as well. That's it, Parachutes.
Parachutes?
I think it was Parachutes.
Parachutes. Yeah. And there's a lot of really good albums that came out in 2001 that launched all these bands that we now know we hear in like top 40 radio. But that kind of put that time period into perspective for me. Like, oh my God, I remember when this album came out and I loved it.
Yeah.
You know, I'm talking about Is This It, not Parachutes.
Yeah, no, it definitely snapshots it. It's so funny that we were all like, oh, I don't know the name of it. And then all three of us were like, actually, we know it. It's Parachutes.
Parachutes.
We all know the Coldplay record. That's awesome, man. So, Matt, we got a pretty solid kickoff pick from you, man. Why don't you go ahead and get us started with your first go around here?
Well, where Rich went with something that was of the recent memory and much more recent history, I went kind of to a Michigan favorite. I'm from Michigan myself, a lot of state pride and all that good stuff. But this is the Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald by singer-songwriter Gordon Lightfoot.
7 p.m. a main hatchway caved in. He said, fellas, it's been good to know ya. The captain wired in, he had water coming in, and the good ship and crew was in peril. And later that night, when his lights went out of sight, came the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
This is a beautiful song, and it tells the history lesson of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, pride of the Great Lakes shipping. When she was launched in 1958, she is going to go down with all hands in a Lake Superior gale on November 10th, 1975. 29 men go down with her. Now, it's chronicling her trip from Superior, Wisconsin, heading down to Zug Island, which is just off Detroit, and she's carrying 26,116 long tons of iron ore pellets. So she is loaded down.
Yeah, that's a weighty ship.
Yeah, and she's going to get up to speed about 14 and a half knots. That was her max fully loaded, and she's moving along. The next day, so she launches on November 9th for this trip back to Zug Island. And the next day, she is going to get caught in this gale. There's a lot of speculation on what actually happened, but the most popular and I think the dominant theory these days is that she gets caught by a rogue wave, and it breaks her back. Actually breaks the ship in half, and she's going to go down not far from Whitefish Bay, about 17 miles from Whitefish Bay. She may have been trying to reach the bay during this storm. She'd been buffeted by 58-mile-per-hour winds with gusts as high as 86 miles per hour. So she was getting pummeled by this storm.
George Clooney could not save them.
No, there would be no.
To be fair, he couldn't save himself in that.
Now, what's fascinating about this tragedy is how fast the reaction is to trying to find her. It's pretty obvious pretty quickly that she's gone down. They can't obviously get out there in the storm, but they're actually going to use aerial equipment usually used for tracking submarines and finding submarines to find this ship. And they will find her in about 530 feet of water on November 14th. So just 4 days after she goes down.
They found her from the air?
From the air, yeah.
Wow.
I can't recall the specific instrument, but it basically picks up magnetic interference from like a submarine or a big chunk of metal under the water, and that's how they found her. And she had broken in half. In fact, her bow is standing straight up and may still be standing straight up, sunk in the mud, where the stern has capsized and it's about 170 feet away from her underwater. So
she broke apart kind of like Titanic did and fell like apart, but she fell like in half and then like apart from each other. They're not like sitting next to each other. They are.
Right. Yeah, there's a debris trail between them, but yeah, the like I said, the main theory is that this rogue wave snaps her in half, and she's carrying so much tonnage that she goes down almost immediately. To this day, her story is commemorated at the Mariners Church in Detroit, and up until 2006, they would actually have a ceremony on November 10th and ring a bell 29 times. They have since expanded that to all mariners lost on the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum has a large exhibit on her, as does the Dawson Great Lakes Museum. So 3 different sites you can learn about the Edmund Fitzgerald, and of course there's lots of theories online, contending theories as to why she may have gone down. Everything from being overloaded to structural failures due to grounding that she'd had problems with earlier in her career, things like that. But it's a fascinating story. It's a powerfully moving song. I've got some harder rock songs later on for the program, but I thought this was a good place to start.
One of my favorite Cleveland beers is the Edmund Fitzgerald Porter.
Well, there you go. Good connection.
That's a good beer name. I love that song. I'm into big shipwrecks. I've been my whole life, and after Titanic, and I'd learned all about it as a kid, I was like, I need another one. And before I landed on Lusitania, for some reason, that was the ship I found next. Was the Edmund Fitzgerald. So it was cool. Now I understand. Didn't they recover the bell from that ship? Isn't that the bell they ring?
Oh wow.
The bell, you're absolutely right. The bell and her anchor have both been recovered. The anchor is at one of the 2 museums I mentioned. I do not recall, I don't believe that is the bell that the Mariners Church rings. I believe that bell is actually with one of the museums, the Dossier Museum, because they got in trouble a few years back about wanting to send it out on tour, essentially. Okay. And these families of the survivors thought that was inappropriate, and so it was decided against that. But yeah, the bell is up out of Lake Superior, as is the anchor.
Well, we got a couple good starters here. We got a solid skater punk song. We got a pretty neat folk rock song, and I'm going to get it started though. For me, right in my wheelhouse, right where you expect me. Anybody that knows me personally, for more than, let's say, 3 or 4 years, knows that I come from a raging heavy metal past. So my first song we're going to get started is right in the world of heavy metal. It is from Metallica's 1984 Ride the Lightning album. It is the song Creeping Death.
Nice, good choice.
The reason I picked Creeping Death was because at the time I discovered it in my life, it was at a pretty formative time. I was going through, like every good Irish Catholic boy, I was going through the confirmation process, CCD, religious ed, and all that stuff, and I was struggling to connect with anything, relating to what my CCD classes were teaching and things like that. And I remember I got an older cousin. And he played the song for me one day, and because I had heard, I guess, Enter Sandman, I was trying to tell him, like, I've heard this cool song because I liked metal and he liked metal, I guess. And he was like, let me play you some real Metallica, which, whole debate for another day. I think that's a crap argument. I think all Metallica is real Metallica. Let's just be real. But anyway, I get the thrash versus the heavier stuff. But he played me Creeping Death, and there was so much that grabbed me about it immediately. It's got a huge opener, really thrashy riffs. And Rich, I know since you're a player, you can back me up on this. There are just some riffs that are fun to play. Like that you will like, I need to learn it. And once you learn it, you're like, yes, because it's fun to do. And Creeping Death is really fun to play as a guitar player. And then when I finally learned how to play it and I got into all the music of it, I was like, all right, well, what the hell is James Hetfield singing about? And then I learned that it was a biblical story. It's a story that comes straight out of the Bible. It's from the book of Exodus. It's about the plagues of Egypt that, as the Israelites, and their exodus from the control of the Pharaoh, who is one of the unnamed pharaohs in the Bible, so we, for actual historical context, we have no clue who they're actually referencing. But the lyrics the song is specifically about the 10th plague, the angel of death that comes and sweeps over, all those that sort of deny the Lord. And he ends up killing the firstborn son. And there's that epic, like, to kill the firstborn Pharaoh's son. And I'm like, whoa, because I also learned about Egypt in school that year. And I was like, you can't kill a Pharaoh's son. That's a big deal. But it was like, I don't know, I was like 13 when all this was happening. All these various dots started to get connected at once, and the song itself was epic. And I remember that, like, in that moment, I realized that heavy metal wasn't just songs about the devil, like all of my adult surroundings were trying to tell me they were. And there was actually some, like, serious intellectual depth to the music I was listening to. Now, don't get me wrong, like, there's a lot of dirty metal. That's exactly what people say it is. But, like, I didn't gravitate towards that stuff. And I started to figure out along the way that bands like Metallica were a little more clever in their lyrics than just, worship this or hurt yourself that, like a lot of people think metal is. And I discovered other bands that follow that, which is why, in addition to the songs we're going to talk about, I got a pretty neat honorable mentions list, because I had a really easy time putting this together, because as a super history nerd and like a metalhead, Matt, Rich, back me up again. If I'm wrong, cut me off or whatever. But like, metal just touches this subject all the time. Like, this is very covered.
The Bible itself is pretty metal if you think about it.
Absolutely. So this was, for me, this was a way that it helped me connect with a place I was struggling to connect with at that time in my life. And so I'll just leave that conversation there. But in terms of what connected me to history, there was, biblical history has a huge place in our world, from, from some of the ways that just people take, the stories they read, the lessons, the faith they take out of it. For me, I was like, cool. The Exodus is pretty metal, and Metallica's super rad. And then from there, it was just like a rabbit hole of more history stuff. So that was my first choice. Rich, from the world of the Exodus, take us to the next spot we're going, buddy.
My second choice is from an artist that I've always appreciated since I was a little kid. I remember my mom got me into him, Billy Joel. I like a lot of his earlier stuff, but there is a song that came out in the year that I was born, 1989. We Didn't Start the Fire. The reason I picked this one, when I was in middle school, I think it was 8th or 9th grade, I had a history teacher, and she was a very influential history teacher for me because she made history exciting.
There you go.
That's very important, especially that was back in 2004, 2005 maybe. And, having a history teacher that can actually approach young kids with early 20th century, mid 20th century history and make it interesting was pretty difficult, especially if you're sticking to, a certain schedule, a certain curriculum. And, this teacher, for example, let us watch Platoon, which I highly doubt you can do that anymore.
What?
There's a period, there's a week straight where every time we'd walk into the classroom for class, we started the class off by listening to We Didn't Start the Fire. And after we listened to We Didn't Start the Fire for this week straight, she would go over the different subject matter that was discussed in Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire, which is all, if I remember right, it's all 20th century subjects, starting in, I think, the 1940s or 50s. One of the first subjects he talks about is Harry Truman. And at the time, like I said, being a young Billy Joel fan, it was not really one of my favorite songs by Billy Joel. I think Billy Joel said himself that if you were to take the music away from that song and literally just have the melody, it's total crap. But content of it is what really makes it interesting.
I've never heard that. That's funny.
The reason that he chose that, or he wrote that song in particular, was apparently Billy Joel had went into the studio, I think it was sometime in 87, 88. And, you know, at that time, Billy Joel's about 40 years old or in his early 40s. And there's a young musician in there. He's about 21 years old. And they're talking about history, or about basically the Cold War era. And Billy Joel basically told this kid, because the kid said that nothing cool was happening in his lifetime. Nothing turbulent was happening in his lifetime in the late 1980s. And then he said that, but then he tells Billy Joel, you know, because Joel got his start, and he was a teenager, I think, in the 1950s. And I guess that this kid basically said that nothing was really happening in the 1950s. Nothing was exciting in the 1950s pertaining to Billy Joel's life. And he's like, well, let me stop you there. We had the Korean War. We had Harry Truman shortly before. We had, you know, all the stuff going on that you don't know about. So he started writing this song, We Didn't Start the Fire. And he's basically outlining all of these important historical events that take place between the early 1950s, late 40s, up until that point in time. And, you know, I think shortly after they released this song is when they collapsed the Berlin Wall. And it kind of just added on to the success of this song. So anyway,
that's
like I
frustrating
said, for me, I
can't believe that kid said that about the 80s. Sorry.
I mean, a lot of us were saying that kind of stuff about the mid 2000s until very recently, where a lot of us are now keeping journals during the COVID-19 pandemic, you know. There's a lot of people between the early 2000s when we went to the Middle East and just in the last couple of years that, you know, people were saying there's nothing of historical significance that's happening right now in the world, when there's stuff happening all the time. You just have to pay attention to it. But anyway, that was Billy Joel's history lesson to a 21-year-old musician that he'd met randomly in a recording studio around 1988.
That's awesome.
Matt,
And it's a pretty cool history lesson.
What was the first historical thing you can remember, Matt? Like, you know, growing up, like the first historically significant moment you remember being tuned in for?
I'm glad you asked, Pat, because I was actually going to mention that in case you didn't, because it was actually, I'm a little older than you guys. I was born in 81. So I remember the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's very vivid, and I basically only see flashes of it from news entries and things of that nature. But it was the first time that, and shortly thereafter, the first Gulf War, when I realized that things were happening on a historical level, that I was witnessing history happening. So I do remember the fall of the Berlin Wall. I do remember Johnny Carson retiring, and of course that
It was huge though.
The very late 80s, early 90s period where we had several things go off right in a row, and then of course the collapse of the Soviet Union. A few years after I went to college, I remembered asking my mom about that time, and she told me at that point that her and Dad and most of their generation never thought they would see the Berlin Wall go down, that it was going to be permanent there, at least in their lifetimes. So to see it come down so quickly like it did in 89 was, it was amazing for them. And it was really something that I began to pay attention to history because of.
Yeah.
I remember as a younger kid, the Gulf War getting started live on CNN.
Yep.
I had this super vivid memory of sitting up against the fireplace, just where the TV was in the house near it. And I had like this fire truck and I was just playing with it on a pillow. I remember my mother, I don't remember what she said, but I remember her exclamation at the sight of what she saw on the news. And I turned and looked at the screen, and it was that very famous image we've all seen now of all the green tracer rounds just hitting the air.
Yep.
And it was just like watching like all these little
like Star Wars
fireflies take off. And at the time I knew it was big, but I didn't understand it obviously until years later. But like I could feel between my mother's reaction the breaking news chyron at the bottom, because that's when they only used it for actual breaking news, not for
Right.
just, hey, we're starting our news cycle over. So between that and all that, I knew that, I was only like 4 or 4.5, but like I knew something was up. And in that memory stayed with me long enough that when I was able to start, asking questions, that was one of the first questions I asked. Because also that year, I'm a big sports guy, and that same year, the New York Giants won the Super Bowl with this war as the backdrop to it. So we got the very famous Whitney Houston national anthem rendition out of this Super Bowl, which is another connecting music to history in a way. Like Whitney Houston's rendition of the national anthem that year is kind of like the accepted standard. Like if you don't Whitney nail it at any sporting event, you didn't nail it, right? So for the record, nobody nails it. 'Cause how can you Whitney nail it? But yeah. So anyway, that's cool. Rich, what was the first sort of thing before we get on here? What was the first sort of thing you remember tuning into, or whatever, when you just started to be aware that things were bigger than just this house you lived in? When was that for you?
I guess, especially regarding contemporary history, I was in middle school, and we were in the cafeteria watching, and when you were mentioning the green, the night vision with the tracers and stuff like that in the Middle East, I remember watching that from our cafeteria. And obviously I remember, like I said, where I was, what I was doing as the events were unfolding on September 11th, 2001. I was actually in history class when it happened. We had just gotten out of homeroom, and we're going to our first class, and they pulled us right back into our history course, and our teachers told us all to sit down, and their jaws were on the floor. They had the TVs turned on, and just as we were sitting down is when we saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center. And I remember like it was yesterday. And then not too long after, like I said, I remember being in the cafeteria at school, the same school, and watching us invade the Middle East. So that stuff really stands out to me. That really kind of opened my mind up to what is happening outside of my little bubble and what is happening outside of our country. And that's something that's really stuck with me ever since. And I've always had an interest in contemporary history since that point.
I'm sure that shapes a lot of your experience being at Flight 93. You have everybody obviously as I remember where I was, if you were around, obviously you're old enough for 9/11, but then to later to go work as being part of a keeper of that story, that legacy at in the field. That's quite a journey. And that was one of the first things when I met you and we worked on the last project we did, way back, I was asking you about what that was like. And I walked away with a tremendous amount of respect for the intensity at which you have to deal with emotion and the modern history, the current political climate that surrounds that even to this day. And so if I didn't ever make that clear to you, not only do I think it's very cool that you work there and you're familiar with that, but I also have a ton of respect for you for doing it. So very cool, Rich.
Well, I really appreciate that. Everything from 2001 onward is connected in some way, shape, or form. So that's always something to keep in mind when you're talking about that period in history. And for anybody who works at some kind of contemporary history site, that's something to keep in mind as well, that you can always connect anything in the last 20 years. No matter who you support politically or anything like that, you're always going to it's going to come full circle regardless.
And just kind of finishing up with the contemporary history thought, I struggled isn't the right term, but I'm not coming at this project and this discussion from the same venue you guys are. You're both excellent historians, but you're also musicians, and I'm not. All three of my siblings are very talented in music. I never was. In fact, my brother, who's immediately below me, I'm the oldest of four, is not only a musician but he also teaches music. And so I reached out to him about this project, and something he told me to keep in mind is that particularly with rock and roll, if there is conflict, if there are issues, this is always going to be inspiration for music, no matter what the type. But rock and roll seems to be particularly suited for this sort of mindset. And if there is some sort of issue, someone's writing a rock song about it. And it doesn't seem to matter what time or era that is happening, though. So I found that rather interesting. This next song that I chose actually is because of my wife. She is the only reason that I got into this band. They were actually opening for another act. The next band I'm going to be touching on is a Swedish power metal band, one of my favorite bands now, Sabaton. They do a lot of military history, great songs. They opened for Nightwish, and I had taken care to see that show, and it was an awesome show, and I just have been devouring their stuff ever since. Knowing that they write songs about military history, when I listened to the song Attack of the Dead Men, I had to find out what they were talking about. Attack of the Dead Men, it's a short power metal song, a lot of energy, a lot of, to be perfectly honest, fun about a very, very terrible day. Pat, you and I are World War I guys, and this is going to the Eastern Front, 1915. And it's about Auschwitz Fortress on the German-Russian border. Now, it's going to be attacked in 1914 at the beginning of the war in September. It's going to hold even against those big guns that had crushed the fortresses around Belgium. It will hold throughout additional bombardments and even some aerial bombing in the winter of 1915. But by that summer, the Germans have a new commander, and it's von Hindenburg. And he is going to begin to ratchet things up. Specifically, in July, the Germans are going to prepare for a poison gas attack. Now, 200,000 tons of poison gas are produced by everybody in World War I. And this stuff is still something that haunts me to this day, the amount of chemical warfare that was used during this conflict. But on August 6th, 1915, the German Empire will unleash 30 batteries of poison gas. It's chlorine, and some historians have also said that it could have been bromine gas as well. Knowing that the Russians in Auschwitz Fortress do not have gas masks. Imagine this, guys, a cloud of greenish yellow fog moving towards your position. Thus far, your fortress has been pounded into rubble, but still defiant. The grass is turning black by this stuff. The leaves are turning yellow and dying in front of you, and it actually begins to corrode your guns and shells. Anything that's brass and copper is beginning to get corrosion on it because of this gas. This attack is going to devastate the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th companies of the 226th Russian infantry, and the Germans think they've got this thing in the bag. When the gas begins to dissipate, they're going to send forward 7,000 Linewehr infantry. These are kind of reserve troops of the German army to clear it out. There's about 100, give or take, survivors of this attack that have wrapped themselves in cloth, wrapped things around their heads, anything they can do to try to dissipate this gas. And they are going to counterattack. It's between 80 to 100 men, depending on who you read. These guys have chemical burns along their bodies. They're weeping fluid from their eyes and other orifices. They're hacking up blood and parts of their lungs. And they will counterattack into these Germans. And this German attack is so thrown off by this apparent attack of dead men that they panic. and they fall back, and they begin to fall back to their own lines, trampling some of their own men, getting caught up on their own wire, allowing the Russians to re-engage with their artillery and also small arms. But they throw this attack back. Most of these guys are dead on their feet. They're going to die of the gas exposure and everything else. And in fact, Osowich Fortress will be abandoned by the Russians 2 weeks later. They're going to blow it and destroy what's left and pull out. But the press is going to get a hold of this defiant resistance and refer to it as the attack of the dead men, or the charge of the dead men. It goes by both names. And it's a powerful song, and I just had to know more about it. So it was definitely one of those songs that inspire you to dig deeper.
The First World War is the most metal of all the wars that can be metal. Just want to say that for the record. And I say that knowing that my next pick is also from a war that has some very metal moments.
Certainly.
But, like, it's also funny because we were talking, in the production of the show, like, picking a Sabaton song is very hard because, like you, I'm also a Sabaton fan. And that's all they do is write songs about military history. And they cover a ton of different eras. And it was like, we could just do a show on Sabaton. Like, I can come with 30 different Sabaton songs. You could have your own 30 different Sabaton songs, and I'm pretty sure there's enough, for Rich to have his own 30 different Sabaton songs. But so that was actually a really good one to pick because I think that illustrates a pretty unique attack. War is something I study because it absolutely terrifies me. Yeah, and I study war because it terrifies me, and hearing stories about things that are scary when it's just normal charges, and then suddenly like zombie charges. Like Russian zombies coming at you. Right. No thanks.
And it seems very surreal too. Like it's really hard to picture that even happening, or having yourself in that situation. I can't imagine myself lasting through something like that. It was like pretty recently that I saw an artist rendition of that.
That's terrifying.
And I remember seeing it. I was like, "What is this?" Like before I even read the caption or read the story. I was kind of horrified by it. I was like, what are these guys with these masks on with blood soaking through? It's freaking me out. Yeah, it's a pretty harrowing story, though.
Hello, everyone. This is Rich Condon, Director of Civil War Pittsburgh. You can check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and at www.civilwarpittsburgh.com. Thank you for listening to the History Things podcast tonight with Pat McGuire and Matthew Borders.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Again, you're listening to the History Things podcast. I'm your host, Pat McGuire. With me today is my co-host, Matt Borders, and joining us is our very special guest and good buddy, Rich Condon. We are talking about connecting you to history through music. Again, it's all around us. And in our first edition of this subject, we're choosing rock and roll as sort of the theme to how we connect with it. We've had some really awesome first and some of the second selections already. And now we're going to get into my second selection, which is another heavy metal song, shocker, for those of you who know me. I'm going to pick a song that came off an album that came out in 2004. Right as I was coming out of high school, so sort of like the NoFX album Rich was talking about, this was an album that kind of hit me at a really pivotal time in my life. This album as a whole does have some of the more contemporary histories on it. They have a song called When Eagles Cry that references the Trade Tower, Pentagon, and Shanksville attacks and the I guess heading into the second Gulf War. But the song I want to pick off this album, which is Iced Earth's 2004 epic, The Glorious Burden, is the album. The song I want to pick is actually more of an opus, and it's technically 3 songs. It is the Gettysburg epic, Gettysburg 1863, at the very tail end of the Glorious Burden album. It is the songs of The Devil to Pay, Hold at All Costs, and High Water Mark. If you listen to all 3 of these really awesome shreddy songs in a row, it just makes up all 3 days of the Battle of Gettysburg. This song was a lot of fun for me for a lot of reasons. And again, like Creeping Death as a player, there are riffs all over these, 3 or 30 minutes of music here that are just really neat to play. It's a really simple and layman's man approach to the war, or the battle, so you can kind of connect with some of the obvious stuff and the big stuff that happens on the Battle of Gettysburg. And the reason for that is, and I didn't notice it until the album had to have been out for like 10 years by the time I noticed it, because I wasn't really big into Civil War films until I got older. Like, even though I grew up in the Ken Burns era, like I watched Ken Burns, but I didn't really watch Gettysburg as a kid, like a lot of us did. Like that movie came around for me more as an adult. So having had a decade of the Iced Earth epic in my head, when I finally saw the movie, I was like, wait a minute, a lot of this song is straight lifted out of the movie. It was like, could you take some of the quotes from the film and set them to epic G.I. Joe sounding metal? And that's the other thing. Like, I'm a huge G.I. Joe guy from like the toys I played with as a kid. And I remember like the big gang vocals, the yo's and the go Joe and all that stuff. And like Iced Earth kind of has that vibe to begin with. But the Civil War epic Gettysburg 1863 was like, if you closed your eyes and tried to imagine Civil War G.I. Joes, this is their soundtrack. And, it was awesome. And Iced Earth is kind of like Sabaton in the sense that they get into history a good bit. John Schaefer, their guitar player, is one of my favorites across the board in a number of ways, kind of like Rich and I, right? He's a history guy and he's a musician. And as a player, John Schaefer's got one of the steadiest right hands in terms of picking. I mean, he's like, when you listen to him do like down picking and palm muted down picking, it's like listening to a metronome or a click track. I mean, he's tight. And so like that was like the discipline really, inspired me to be a better player. But man, I loved that song. I thought it was a really cool, history lesson, and on top of being a metal song, and then I realized it's just a really awesome metal song and a sweet metal rendition of the movie. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. Not a ton of people are familiar with the Iced Earth.
I remember there was a period where when I was younger, I was kind of looking through, I think it might have been like iTunes and Spotify or something, and music related to Gettysburg, and then Iced Earth came up. I'd never heard of Iced Earth before, but I saw like some of the album art. I'm like, what the hell is this? And then I saw that like some of the lyrics were like stolen right out of Gettysburg. Like I could hear Sam Elliott talking through the song. But yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And it was just such a strange concept to me. It was very metal. I don't know how else to describe it.
Matt, you're a Civil War guy, like through and through, like all the rest of us here. So tell us where Iced Earth Civil War epic Gettysburg shows up in your world. Is it one of your favorites? Is it one of your not favorites?
I enjoy it for what it is, but it's not the best rendition of metal nor history. It's got a very kind of almost a hair metal feel to it, and I don't mean that as an insult, but it's just not usually my brand of metal. It's funny though, because I ran into Iced Earth through wargaming. I'm a huge nerd, do tabletop wargaming, and I was looking for good wargaming music, and I ran into Iced Earth and Gettysburg 1863 through that, when I was specifically looking for music to jam out to while I'm rolling my dice and playing little battles on the tabletop.
Dude, my favorite part about you telling that story is that Matt Callery from the Addressing Gettysburg podcast is listening up in Gettysburg right now, and he is just writing more in the narrative of our Dungeons and Dragons epic people lore, because he just keeps doubling down on your nerd levels, and I freaking love it, dude.
Great.
Rich, when we were up in Gettysburg, to talk about our show on Matt Callery's Addressing Gettysburg, Matt wrapped up the show with asking us a little bit about us, not just about the history and stuff, but about who we are as people. And I mentioned the music and sports, and Matt went right to Dungeons and Dragons. Like he was like a big nerd at Dungeons and Dragons. And before Matt could really even explain it, Matt Callery was like, hold on. And we had like a 30-minute explanation from Matt Borders here on how to play with other Matt, peppering him with these crazy questions. And we went on a journey together, and Peopledore, the centaur who rides a chariot, was born. It was pretty epic. Enough Dungeons and Dragons here. Rich, go ahead and let's before we get to our honorable mentions, let's go ahead and take everybody through our final picks of the day here. So Rich, final round here. What's the last song you want to connect our listeners to that sort of shares some history?
So my final song is actually from a band called The Band, and I'm sure most of you have heard of this song. I have to say that usually around mid-April every year, I see a lot of people on Facebook posting this song because it's called "The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down." And
Nice.
I do see a lot of Civil War nerds posting this song, around mid-April, April 9th in particular. I picked this song because obviously we're all Civil War nuts, and this song, which actually came out in, I believe it was 1969 on the band's second album, it was a self-titled album, talks about the tail end of the American Civil War from the perspective of what Robbie Robertson, the core writer of the song, described as a point of view from a poor Southerner in the Confederate Army, at the very end of the Civil War and kind of shortly after the American Civil War. They mentioned specifically George Stoneman's raid near the Danville train in Southern Virginia, and as he's moving through northern North Carolina. And a lot of people kind of perceive this song, maybe they didn't perceive it this way at the time, but it's a very lost causer song.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah.
and that's how, I guess that's how it was really, that was kind of the general point of view in the mid-late 1960s. Confederate culture was kind of like a hot thing. If you watch a lot of old Westerns, you always find some token guy in the background with a Confederate kepi on, or some kind of Confederate uniform on his body. And it was, kind of like this very, I guess, lack of a better word, a very cavalier thing. He would have, saw Confederate culture as something very ideal. Obviously, we interpret that period in history much differently now than it was in the mid and late 1960s. But this song in particular kind of became a part of that culture. And it wasn't really, from my understanding, it wasn't extremely popular at first when it was released in '69 until actually 2 years later. It was covered by Joan, and I'm sorry if I butcher her last name, Joan Baez.
Joan Baez.
Shut up. Joan Baez. But she did a rendition in 1971, which became a little bit more popular and really kind of brought the song to light and really pushed the band's version out in the light. I think the last time they played this song live was during the Last Waltz, if I remember right. I think Levon Helm actually said, and I love Levon Helm, he wouldn't play it anymore because it's a little convoluted, but either because of her version of it he didn't really approve of, or I guess it was something over writers' rights.
I'm talking from my raps.
Anyway, he refused to play the song after they released The Last Waltz. There's one review that I wanted to actually read that I found from the Rolling Stone that came out in October of '69. It's from writer Ralph Gleason. He said, "Nothing I have read has brought home the overwhelming human sense of history that this song does. The only thing I can relate it to at all is the red badge of courage. It's a remarkable song. The rhythmic structure, the voice of Levon, and the bass line with the drum accents, and then the heavy, close harmony of Levon, Richard, and Rick in the theme, make it seem impossible that this isn't some traditional material handed down from father to son, straight from that winter of 1865 to today. It has that ring of truth, that ring of truth, and the whole aura of authenticity.
I want to chime in right away. So bad. Like, God, I just need to say for the record that this review is further evidence that Rolling Stone has no clue what they're doing. I'm not a professional musician anymore, so shade, throwing all the shade at Rolling Stone. Your top 100 guitarist list sucks, and this review is trash.
But that's one of the first reviews that come out after the album comes out. And from what I understand, that particular album, the band's self-titled album, they wanted to weave this theme of old Americana throughout the entire album, and that's, I think, why that song in particular they thought would be perfect for that album. I mean, if you even look at the cover of the album, the guys are wearing, you know, clothing that looks like it belongs in the 1880s or 1890s, you know. But anyway, I thought that was, I would say, out of really most well-known songs in pop culture, is probably, I would say, the most well-known song related to the American Civil War era, especially when they're mentioning by name, you know, a federal commander, Stoneman. They mention Lee. You know, they talk about, they kind of sum up, obviously, in just a couple of minutes what's happening at the tail end, April 1865, and kind of what happens afterward. But I would say when you're tying music to pop culture, this one kind of sticks out in my mind.
Yeah, that's a great choice too, Rich, because like you said, it's very indicative of the period. We're just coming off the centennial at that point. And so there's a lot of memorialization that's already happened and a lot that's kind of still in the air. We're just before that period where we start seeing pushback against that in the mid to late 70s and early 80s, especially when we start to get more into African-American participation, which was, for the most part, well, pretty much entirely left out of the centennial commemorations. So yeah, excellent choice.
Yeah. And I really think, obviously, they kind of glorify that culture as well, which, as you said, there is pushback against it shortly after. But I think as far as kind of moving that period, the 1860s and Civil War period, into top 40 culture, I think that song, out of, I don't know how many actually talk about the Civil War in pop culture, kind of did that job. I do know one other song, I think it was like earlier in Taylor Swift's career, and I'll admit I've heard this song, that actually talks about the Battle of Stones River. Don't look at me like that. I listened to it for historical research purposes strictly.
It's like reading Playboy for the articles. You're a Taylor Swift fan. Rich Condon.
No, I'm not a T Swift fan. I'm sorry.
He's a T Swifty guy. The bands, the night they drove Dixie down, was on my honorable mentions list, and I'm glad you picked the song to talk about, because I agree that it is probably the most recognizable pop culture, musical song, like a top 40 kind of thing that relates to the American Civil War, and I think that that's a shame, because to me it's a garbage song, and I like the band, like the band itself, because like I'm a huge Southern rock guy. And like when I think of the band, I want to think about songs like Up on Cripple Creek. This is a song that definitely glorifies the whole notion of the glorious Confederate soldier. They fought through their hunger and all this other bullshit.
Yeah.
Whatever, dude. And Stoneman's Raid is a cool historical reference, because Stoneman doesn't get a ton of love in the overall historical community. Like, we spend a lot of time focusing on bigger names like especially in the federal world, like Custer or Wesley Merritt and things like that with cavalry and stuff. So I like that. The thing that kills me, and Matt and I talked about this a lot, is the lyric in that song that kills me the most is when the singer, our protagonist, whose name I think is Virgil Payne, he's like swearing to God that he's seeing Robert E. Lee in Tennessee, and it's like, no, just
right.
Yeah, that was kind of strange. That part was pretty strange. Yeah. And they definitely they put, which is kind of strange. They put him, not strange because it was, I guess, fairly common at that point, but kind of putting Lee on a pedestal.
Oh yeah,
and painting him in like this godlike picture, which, and as you said, once you hear that he's in Tennessee, it threw me off at that point. I was like, you kind of lost me there, bud.
Yeah. So the other thing that's, interesting for me is I like, I'm going to pull an Avery Lentz here and I'm going to get a little real. Because this is at a time, like Matt was saying, the centennials just happened, but this is also at a time where the civil rights movement is really, 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 ratcheting up in our nation, and it's becoming like the issue, on a social level, like in conversations at restaurants, at bus stops, in your house, kind of thing. Like everything is revolving around civil rights, and whether people like it or not, the southern states' reaction to the civil rights movement 100 years after the fact of the war, a lot of it was this really dumb defiance and this glorification of the lost cause. And songs like this popped up. I'm a huge Lynyrd Skynyrd fan, and I just went and saw them on their farewell tour, and they still bring the flags out on stage, and it's just the culture of the lost cause that swelled up in response to the civil rights movement, and it rallied around, unfortunately, a lot of places like Southern Rock. It gave us these gems, and I'm going to say the word gem so that everybody understands I'm being sarcastic and ironic here, that, the bands, The Night They Drove All Dixie Down, is just a crap song, It's got a good melody. If you want to sing it, cool. But like, if you want to connect to history, like, it's actually not a good history lesson. It's glorifying things that are wrong, and it's putting people in places they never were. And so you're not actually connecting to any real history other than they're trying to talk about a war that was very real. And I actually hate this song.
The fun part is, Robbie Robertson apparently spent about 8 months writing this song and visiting his local library to do historical research on the subject matter for The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down.
That's 8 months of his life he's never going to have gotten back.
He'll never get it back.
Jesus. That's a great pick, though, and I'm so glad you brought it up, because I think that the conversation about kind of knocking it off with how good of a Civil War song this is something we should really start doing. If we're going to be honest with the history and legacy of the Civil War, like we've been fortunate enough to start being able to do more so in the last 10 years, where we've been able to get into more of the facts and less away from the glorifications. So one of the things that eventually needs to happen is the pop culture aspect needs to follow suit, and we need to address things like songs like this, which are nifty little rock and roll songs and absolutely terrible history lessons.
If you really want your history and you want to learn about Stones River, just listen to T Swift.
Yeah, dude. Biggest fan in the world here. Trust Rich Condon. Matt, why don't you go ahead and get us your final offering here, my man?
Sure, Pat. Piggybacking off of what you had said earlier about being able to do an entire show just on the Sabaton songs, the last band I chose is another one that really hits the military history hard, and it is, of course, Iron Maiden. Now, we're going to be looking at specifically one that you turned me on to, because I hadn't realized that they'd had a song specifically about Passchendaele.
On his dying words he prays, tell the world of Passchendaele.
Third Battle of Ypres. This is a nasty, nasty fight in the summer of 1917, runs from July to November of 1917, and it is for the control of the ridges south and east of Ypres in Belgium. So once again, World War I. Now, what's fascinating about this song is that it's actually pretty good history. It really gets the point across of how terrible this was, because Third Ypres or Passchendaele is really best remembered for those classic horrible images of World War I. The deep trenches, the mud, the shell holes filled with water and viscera and everything else. These are the truly apocalyptic images and really the thoughts that most people have when they think of World War I, and they come from this battle particularly. Of course, the offensive was not recommended by the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. The French Chief of Staff, Ferdinand Foch, had also recommended against it. The French were just coming off of a terrible offensive they'd had in the spring, the Nivelle offensive. We've had some mutinies within the French army, and there's a real desire on a part of a lot of the Allies to basically sit tight, hold the line, and wait for the Americans to show up to help reinforce their positions and push beyond them. Of course, April 6th, 1917, the United States had declared war on Germany and had become part of the war, but they're not going to be able to get troops over there for some time yet. Now, unfortunately for the Allies, Sir Douglas Haig, this is his plan, and he would push it forward and eventually launch it in late July of 1917. And we are going to have a series of battles within this larger fight, some very famous ones that you've heard of and researched, Pat, of course, the Messinine Ridge, Picklum Ridge, the Battle of Hill 70, one of your favorites, the Menin Road. All of these battles are occurring within this larger context of Third Ypres, and of course the Battle of Passchendaele occurs in October. And this bogs down due to the weather. This is when those late fall, early winter rains of Northern Europe are going to come in. It's going to soak an already wet battlefield and region, and that's when this terrible, terrible mud is really going to be coming into play. Now, eventually it's going to be called off due to the weather. David Lloyd George referred to it as one of the greatest disasters of the war, where the Germans in their histories actually refer to it as it brings on the near disaster, or the near destruction, I should say, of the German army, just because they're compelled to try to defend these lines before eventually falling back, that defense in depth that we see during the First World War. And both sides are going to suffer in the neighborhood of 400,000 casualties, which is just horrifying for as little as this engagement will do.
This battle is definitely the battle I think of when I close my eyes and imagine the First World War. I imagine the mud. I imagine that very famous photograph of the blown out forest and all the very thin and dead trees, the tree mass that are left behind. It's terrifying. And to know that the first thing you learn about this battle is that more or less, despite everything you said, the thing that the men on both sides of no man's land were fearing the most wasn't really necessarily each other and the lead they were throwing at each other, but the mud that they were standing in itself was the enemy of all. And Passchendaele's a mess. And when I discovered that Iron Maiden had written a song by it, and you and I both being World War I guys, I was like, did you know this? And it was an epic song. It's an epic song. But Iron Maiden songs are always epic. So, well, wrapping up the final round here, my final offering is I cheated again, just like I did in round two. I didn't pick just one song. I picked more or less one topic and two songs that sort of connect to this. So, I'm an American, but I'm an Irish American. You know, I come from Irish descent. My name is Patrick McGuire. So, shocker, Irish. And my family is very big, like a lot of Irish families are, on its old country roots and heritage. And I grew up with the family owning a ton of pubs and knowing all the sing-alongs and Oh Danny Boy and just the Fields of Athenry. And these are all like songs I connected to, but I could tell they were singing about a history that I really knew nothing about, because those were histories from hundreds of years ago. And as we know as historians, it's hard to connect the stuff that long ago, even when you're deeply passionate about it. You can study it and be interested, but it's hard to find the personal connection to it all. So what I wanted to know was sort of like, what was a little bit, more like going on more with Ireland's history as I got older. And I remember as a kid, when I say as I got older, when I went from like 6 to 9. So, but I remember hearing a couple songs and really liking them. And it was like, my dad really liked them. And at first, these songs for me were just really cool memories of me and my dad driving around to baseball practice and stuff. And so the songs are U2's Sunday Bloody Sunday. And the Cranberries' Zombie. My dad loved a lot of that kind of rock, the kind that you hear. We have a station down here called Wash FM, which plays a lot of that kind of dad rock. You'd hear stuff like that on there. So at first, these songs all just kind of were like a nostalgic thing for me. But as I got older and became a musician myself and understood that the things that I'm writing about reflect my world in good, bad, and ugly ways, it occurred to me that references to bombs and guns and 1916 and Zombie might have a little more substance than just, teen angst in the 90s, So I did some digging and I learned, that these songs were about the Irish Troubles, which is a more contemporary Irish history. The English and the Irish have a long back and forth, tumultuous relationship that usually focuses most famously along the lines of Irish Catholic versus English Protestant. And the Irish or the English occupation of Ireland has always been a really, really, really sensitive and big deal. Even after the 1916 Easter Sunday Uprising, the Michael Collins Rebellion, and the later independence of the Irish Republic, as the 20th century progressed, England, as they do, the United Kingdom does today, still maintains sovereignty over Northern Ireland. It is a Protestant nation that is still part of the United Kingdom, whereas the Republic of Ireland is Catholic and not. And so the Republic of Ireland was not, and still is, a huge fan of the English occupation of what they believe to be their whole island, and there's these big pushes for Irish unification and stuff. And U2's Sunday Bloody Sunday references an incident in the Troubles in 1972 where protesters, elements of the Irish Republican Army, which, if you get into the history of it, they don't really, they're more or less a terrorist organization at times throughout the history of the Troubles. The name can be deceiving. They are responsible for the deaths, which can very literally be called murders of around 5,000 people, and a lot of them are children. And in 1972, the occupation is once again at a boiling point, and the British Army is sent in. Paratroopers are sent in to sort of keep things calm, and things escalate, and these paratroopers actually open fire on a crowd of unarmed Irish demonstrators, and they kill a bunch of them, and it becomes known as the Bloody Sunday incident. And the band U2 is, for those of you who are fans, U2 has been around since the 70s. They didn't just show up in the mid 80s with a Joshua Tree and become like uber famous and Bono and the Edge. Like, they were around in the late 70s, and so this song really shaped who they were. They're an Irish band. And they write a lot of politically charged songs. And I think people know that now because Bono writes a lot of songs about climate change. And people like to poke fun at Bono because of his, Bono-ness and his sunglasses. But Bono being topical is nothing new. And Sunday Bloody Sunday was one of those songs. And Zombie comes, basically 20 years from that incident. It comes in 1993. I think it comes out in 94, but it references a 1993 flare-up of the Troubles, where once again the Irish Republican Army is going about trying to see to their ends, which is getting the British out of all of Ireland, not just Ireland, but Northern Ireland. And they set off a bomb in Warrington, England, and it kills 2 young boys. And this is just like as was going on in Bono's time, but it's more so now going on during when like Dolores O'Riordan, the singer of the Cranberries, is writing about it. The younger generations of the Irish are starting to be over this in big ways. It's not just about, you know, the Irish independence and screw England anymore. There's a lot of younger Irish who are like, look, this isn't my fight. You know, like, I love a united Ireland, great, but like, I'm not out here killing your kids. And so like, if you're listening to Zombie and you're listening to Dolores sing, you know, it's not me, it's not my family in your head, what she's telling you is like, it's not my family that's killing your kids. We're not a part of what the IRA is. Like, they're basically trying to distance themselves from the bad eggs of their own people. And, you know, growing up in an Irish family as a young kid, you kind of get the impression that we're all just pots of gold and shamrocks and singing, you know, jigs and things like that. And everything's these nice rainbowy, lucky charmy fairy tales. And then Irish history is really brutal and sad. And it's not really yesterday or super far away. It's more or less like in all of our lifetimes. I mean, all of us were walking this earth by the end of the late 80s. I know Rich, you showed up right at the end in 89, but by the time these two young boys are unfortunately killed, you know, we've been on this earth for a while. So like, this isn't that long ago. And the Irish Troubles are something that, you know, go through this sort of up and down with the public's fascination. And right now, it's kind of up. There's a TV show called Derry Girls, which is focused Derry, Derry, like County Derry in Ireland, not like dairy milk. But it's focusing on, you know, a bunch of schoolgirls living during the time of the 1972 Bloody Sunday era. Of the Troubles. So that was something that just shaped me a lot, because I learned that, you know, my family's roots are not just pots of gold and rainbows and Lucky Charms and beer. You know, that was it. So,
well, as a fellow person of Irish descent, Condon is an Irish name. You know, I've done quite a bit of research in my family's history, and, you know, we date back to the Norman invasion. You know, my family had it. Actually, there's a castle that still stands. It was called Condon Castle, that was taken over during the Norman invasion as well. But that aside, I actually want to mention to you, I don't know if you've seen this before, but there's a film that came out back, I think it was around 2008, 2009, called It Might Get Loud. Have you seen that yet?
No,
I haven't.
So it's actually really good. It stars a few different people. Jimmy Page is one of them, Jack White, and The Edge. And they kind of delve into all of their backstories.
I've seen parts of this. You're right. They got all their gear out and they're playing. And yes, I know about this project.
Ironically,
I haven't seen it all the way through.
And this is kind of I'm sorry to spoil it for anybody who has not seen it, but I think they end the film with everyone picking up their guitars and playing The Weight from the band. But kind of bring it full circle. But anyway, The Edge actually goes into the history of U2, how the band started, and how they started during this, you know, period in Ireland's tumultuous history. You know, what really inspired them to pick up instruments and start playing and writing the songs they did, talking about Irish history.
I'm big into the heritage, and that was a very sobering, you know, reminder that history isn't always pretty, but more specifically, words are hard. My family's roots come out of a lot of heartbreak, and yeah.
Well, the Irish seem, as many cultures are, very aware of their history. And they, like you said, they've got songs that are still sung today that date back hundreds of years. A lot of cultures do that, but perhaps it's because there's so much Irish heritage in the United States, we tend to be very aware of those. And the Irish lament is a fascinating just way of singing something, almost mourning the past, and the song itself is a very mournful way to do things. That's not obviously these particular songs, but it's something that I've always liked about Irish music. In regards to the Troubles, it was very interesting for me growing up in the late 90s and early 2000s to come to realize how recent that all was. I mean, the Troubles don't technically end until what? The Easter Sunday Accords in 98?
Yeah, 98.
Yeah.
I think it's called the Good Friday Agreement.
Excuse me. Yes, Good Friday Accords. But it's terrifying. These bombs going off in Belfast and other places. Just to learn about that when I was younger and impressionable, it was very interesting and very, very sad at the same time.
Yeah, it's certainly a powerful song, set of songs, and the Troubles are something that I hope a lot of younger Irish Americans sort of look into their roots. You know, we don't just sing jaunty jigs and drink beer and remember Michael Collins, even though Liam Neeson was a great Michael Collins. Liam Neeson.
Liam Neeson.
Yeah, Liam Neeson's. God, and Bruce Willis. God, I just can't deal. That was such a great show. All right, well, let's see. Before we get out of here today, I've had a lot of fun with this. Were there any honorable mentions you guys want? Because I have a list here of a few honorable mentions that I think we should maybe throw out there. I don't know if you want to get us going, Matt, or if Rich, do you have any honorable mentions?
Matt, you can start it off.
Okay.
All right, Matt, let's get us going here, buddy.
All right. I'm just going to run through my 5 honorable mentions real quick. Real quick, my honorable mentions, interestingly enough, are almost all anti-war songs, as opposed to looking into the history of warfare and things of that nature. Almost all of these are anti-war, and leading it off is a favorite from Forrest Gump, of course, Fortunate Son, Creedence Clearwater Revival. Run for the Hills by Iron Maiden is unfortunately about the extermination of American Indians. It really gets into that, does not pull any punches. There were 2 songs that I wanted to mention in particular because we don't generally think about these groups for their history, but I'm a big Rob Zombie fan, and his song Scorpion Sleeps specifically references the death of Black Kettle at the Sand Creek Massacre in 1863, and I believe it makes veiled references to the atrocities in the Congo in the late 19th and early 20th century. Rob Zombie. We don't think about that from him, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, because we just want Rob Zombie to slam us in the back of his Dragula.
That's true. Now, Black Sabbath, another band we don't necessarily think about when we're thinking about history in songs, but War Pigs is a powerful, powerful anti-war song, specifically looking at the dangers of not only industrialized warfare, but the industrial military complex and its relationship with politics. So I really wanted to touch on that as well. And of course, to wrap it up, Guns N' Roses' Civil War. It's a perfect, another perfect song, really good anti-war song. So those are my quick rundown for runners-up.
All right, I'll go next. My honorable mentions list are kind of all over the map, but more or less hang out in the world of metal, because as I do this project live with all of us now, I'm more one-dimensional than I realize. So we'll kick things off with a song called The Odyssey by Symphony X, which is a power metal band. This song is more historical literature than actual like a rendition of a historical fact, because I don't believe there's any historical fact that Odysseus, like the Odyssey was real and Cyclops, Sirens, and all that other Bush League or whatever. But this is a really cool song. It's like a 24-minute epic that covers the entire Odyssey. Like basically a minute for every year that he's gone. I think he's gone 20 years. It's 24 minutes. So you get a little context on both sides of the song. That's pretty epic. I got Angel of Death by Slayer. This song is a highly controversial song even now. And when it came out, it was also controversial. This song is about Joseph Mengele, the Nazi doctor, with all the awful and abhorrent experiments obviously conducted during the Second World War. The release of this song is one of these things that sort of, if you think about Slayer and you've heard any of their accusations against them about being sympathetic towards Nazism and things like that, this derives from the release of this song. That's something that stayed with them forever. And Slayer has very vehemently denied that this is a pro or a glorification. It's merely just them writing a song about something and being metal as shit while they do it. But I'll leave it for you to decide what it is. I'm a huge Slayer fan. The song is definitely hard. it's harsh, in terms of its lyrical content and things. But then again, so is Joseph Mengele. So I don't know how you dance around that topic if you're going to write about it at all. If anybody's going to write about that, it should be Slayer. But moving on from there, I have 1916 by Motorhead, which is another British band writing another song about the First World War. Right. Obviously, the reason for this is because in our country, we grew up in the shadow of the Second World War as like our big moment on the battlefield. And so if you close your eyes as an American and try to think of what an American battlefield looks like, you think of, the Second World War or Vietnam, or you think of the Desert Storm or the Gulf Wars, Afghanistan kind of things we've been involved in our time. The British have all been raised in the shadow of the trenches and the gas and the mud of the First World War. Even up until our generation of people walking the earth. The band Bullet for My Valentine has a song called Scream, Aim, Fire, which falls in line with Motorhead's 1916, which is just this is our sort of experience and memory of the First World War. And this song stuck out to me because it's the only ballad let me rephrase that. It's the first ballad I ever heard by Motorhead. So it's just Lemmy, as falsetto of a voice as he can get, and a piano. And, it's quite a removal from the Ace of Spades. I got The Trooper by Iron Maiden. So I got an Iron Maiden song on my honorable mentions list. This song is about the charge of the Light Brigade during the Crimean War, another big moment in British military history. The song basically just grabs you in the first stanza when they talk about firing muskets and running you through with bayonets. And I was like, okay, 10-year-old me assumes that all bayonets and muskets are about the Civil War. So I spent a lot of years thinking this was a Civil War song, and then got older and realized that muskets were more than just Civil War rifles. And but it was cool, right? So like that was one of the first things that introduced me to the Crimea, was Bruce Dickinson wailing behind some twin guitars. And then we've already mentioned the night they drove Dixie down. That was on my list. And my last song is also a Sabaton song, just like Matt picked out earlier. It is the song is called Fields of Verdun, which is a newer song. It came out, I think, in June of 2019. But the song Fields of Verdun, if I could describe it in a short and succinct way, it's like 4 minutes of just absolute fury, just like the artillery bombardments of that battle. Great lyrics, great hook, great solo, great gang vocals, everything about it. And the video is absolutely epic too. So if you're one of those people that still wants to see a YouTube music video, I highly recommend not just the song, but the video for Fields of Verdun too. They have some great living historians in that video. So that's it for me. That's my final round. That's my honorable mentions. And we'll wrap the show up with our guest of honor here, Rich. Any honorable mentions, any final words from you, my friend?
I have 3 honorable mentions, actually. I'm going to start off with Ohio from, I believe it was Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, or was it just Neil Young?
I think it's it's CSN. I think it's CSNY. I think it's all of them.
Okay. So Ohio, if nobody's ever heard it before, you might have been living under a rock. But it's about Ohio is about the Kent State shootings. The song came out in 1970 in response to the shootings at the Kent State campus, where you have United States National Guardsmen opening fire on students of Kent State University, and kind of folding that story into the greater narrative of the Vietnam era. And actually, I'll be honest, pretty much all these songs are from the Vietnam era, because if you look at any period in history, as far as military actions go, I feel like the Vietnam era is one era where you have more songs written about that particular conflict than you do any other war in American history, because it's a big part of the counterculture. Right. Another one is going to be What's Going On from Marvin Gaye, 1971. It's basically lamenting the fate of Vietnam era youth. It's kind of a song of confusion. If you think about by 1971, what's happening in Vietnam, there's this back and forth between, people back in the States and, people who are actually serving in Vietnam, wondering what are we actually doing over there. that song kind of lends itself to that. And finally, I am a big, I was raised by my dad to be a big Beatles fan, in particular John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Happy Christmas, The War Is Over by John Lennon, which came out in 1972. Obviously, Lennon was a big anti-war activist as well. That's my final pick, and that's my last shout out.
Was that John Lennon and Plastic Ono Band, or was that just John Lennon by himself?
I think it was him and his wife Yoko Ono. I don't know if it was like the Plastic Ono Band or not. But yeah, I think it was him and it featured Yoko Ono as well, but I just don't pay attention to that.
Our good friend Avery Wentz would highly approve of your honorable mentions, because I consulted with Avery since he's one of our good friends. I just asked him, I was like, hey, if I had you on this show, and what songs would you pick for this? And he was like, I have a strong Vietnam playlist.
Yeah, he did mention
like
that.
when he works out,
and they're great songs too.
Protest.
Yeah,
it's like you could literally have every song that was written during the Vietnam era, at least like the more popular ones, and I could listen to it straight through and not want to switch a song.
My first connection to like the protest era of the Vietnam rock and roll songs and stuff came from Bruce Springsteen, because I'm a huge Bruce Springsteen fan, and luckily enough for me, when I was born, a bunch of his great albums had already been out. And most importantly of which was his live 75 to 85 album, which, dude, if I was a music fan, like if I could release albums like when I was a professional the way Bruce did this, where he had like one or two, maybe like 3 albums that were out, and then suddenly this live album came out and it had like 66 songs on it. It was like his entire catalog plus covers and B-sides. It was just so much content to absorb at one time. It was great. So when I was a kid, like this had been out for a few years kind of thing. And so I got to go through it and listen. And I remember listening, there's a great cut of him covering War, the famous War, good God, y'all, right?
Edwin Starr.
Yeah, and my first experience to this is Bruce Springsteen, and one of the reasons I love Bruce is because if you ever seen Bruce live, or if you ever listen to his live shows, is it's not just a 3 or 4 hour concert of songs end on end on end. Bruce is a really fantastic storyteller, and a lot of his songs have really great setups, either just by musical interludes and short stories, or sometimes really long-winded stories. And on the album version that I have, Bruce tells a really long version of sort of what it was like going into the Vietnam War. He does this on the same album, on the Cut the River, where he kind of talks about in that song what it was like getting called for the draft and what it was like, him and his relationship with his dad. But in War, he was just kind of just talking about the uselessness and the senselessness of it all. And I'll never forget, the story was so good that by the time the song's about to drop, I'm hanging on every word of it. And he starts doing the rock and roll thing. He's like, of course I'm talking about. And right when he hits it, he's like, "War!" The whole band drops. And I was like, like the 10-year-old be like floored to the side of the house, like, oh my God. But I immediately asked my dad about that, because the Gulf War had already happened in my life, and I had been a little sobered by, look, G.I. Joes are fun, but people actually die in war. I'd already kind of discovered the Civil War, so I already knew that war leads to awful things, and so I wanted to know what war Bruce was talking about. So my dad told me about that. And then as I got older, I asked again, and I got to hear my dad's personal draft story and things like that, which was really cool. So I connected to the protest songs through somebody that people don't usually connect to Vietnam protest outside of maybe Born in the USA. But he does a bitch and cover of War that I would put right up there with Creedence's anti-war songs. Well, Matt Borders, before we get on out of here, any parting shots from you? Final word from my co-host, Matt Borders.
No, not really, Pat. It's been a great show. Again, this was something that I was coming at from a strictly history point of view, because I wanted to know your guys' take on things, being the professional musicians. And I really appreciate not only your thoughts on the matter and your picks, but Rich joining us today for this event. Both of you guys have such a deep background in music that I do not have, and I really appreciate your insights.
Excellent. All right, well, like Matt said, we want to thank everybody for stopping by. Thank you again, Rich, for coming out. You want to make sure you check out Rich Rich, go ahead and plug the Civil War work you do. I know we plugged Surf Camp at the beginning, but tell our listeners where to find you on social media for all the awesome work you do in Civil War interpretation and preservation.
Sure. I actually operate the Civil War Pittsburgh Facebook page, Instagram, Twitter. We also have a website, www.civilwarpittsburgh.com. And you can find a lot more in-depth stories on civilwarpittsburgh.com. You know, if you see something that might interest you on our social media accounts, you can get a little bit more of the scoop on our website. I'm also one of the contributors to Pennsylvania and the Civil War, which is also a blog, but we also operate on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as well. So those are the two places you can find me. And like Matt, I am also a National Park Service employee as well. That's why I'm in South Carolina now. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, I just took a job with Reconstruction Era National Historical Park. So if any of you are ever in the area of Beaufort or Port Royal, please stop by once things are open and moving kind of as normal as they were before, you know, March or February of 2020. Please stop in and say hello.
Awesome. Great stuff. So I'll sign off with a few pretty thoughts here. One, absolutely take Rich up on his offer if you're down in Beaufort near Port Royal and all that stuff. I've gotten to know Rich a little bit over the last year or so. He's one of the brightest up-and-comers in the industry. He's a fantastic storyteller. So I can't wait to hear what you do at Reconstruction Era down there. I will probably make it to you in pursuit of a different venture of my nerddom. I'm a huge pirate guy. And Blackbeard the Pirate has some strong connections to Beaufort down there. So I will probably make it down there at some point, following the path of Edward Teach as he controlled the Carolinas, both Carolinas, the coasts of North and South at the time. But I really appreciate you, Rich, for coming out here, for bringing your musical expertise, your historical expertise. And then like Matt, I know you're kind of hard on yourself for not being a pro musician, but you grew up in the times we all lived in, and all three of us, you know, we've lived through a lot of the events we talked about, and everybody, you know, brought some really unique and powerful perspectives, you know, to the table here. And one of the things we wanted to do with this was like sort of just, you know, remind you, the whole theme of this is like connecting you to history through music. It's to remind you that history it's first of all, it's happening every day. It's happening all around you. Like the COVID world we're living in is not the only history. Like there's history being made in sports, in politics, in business. History is happening at all times. And music is reflecting what's happening at all times. And so history gets reflected more often than you realize it, even in Taylor Swift songs, like Rich's favorite band, Taylor Swift and the Taylor Swiftie. And, you know, so just remember that, you know, you don't have to go looking real far. You don't always have to go look into a textbook if you just want, you know, to connect with something. In fact, my favorite part of tonight's show has been how different the approaches have been between Matt, Rich, and myself, because music is exactly that. It's personal. It means something entirely different to the three of us on this panel tonight than it does to you, the listener, you know, listening at home or in your car right now. And I think that that's important. So my personal philosophy to end the show has always been to connect with history however you can. And if you were unaware prior to this episode that you can listen to some rock and roll songs and still get taught something out of it, you know, my goal is that I'm glad. I hope that you realize that you don't just have to learn from a teacher or a history book. You can learn from some outside the box places. So you can catch Matt Borders on Instagram at Matt Borders Books. Matt's got some exciting news coming up on our mid-year episode, which will be out in just a matter of weeks. So make sure you check back. We got a special announcement coming from my buddy Matt here. You can follow me at History Things with Pat, flashing in the background here on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Just a real casual approach to most historical topics. Some you're familiar with, some you're not. And like Rich, I'll go ahead and plug my band, even though that Rich's music project is active. My project, my brother from another mother, my best friend in life, Jonathan Filson, and I, who has been my drummer in every band I've ever been in, he and I are celebrating 20 years of making music together this year. So if you want to go on Facebook and head on over to the page Old Mally, AULDMALLY. We'll throw it up on the screen here and give us a like. We're going to be pulling some songs out of the vault all year, and they come from all 20 years of John and mine's ridiculous ride through musical infamy. Our band Twitcher, our band Lysergic Cross, and our band Old Mouse. So, boys, I thank you so much for stopping by. This has been a lot of fun. We'll do the music chat again in a few weeks with a different musical theme, maybe country, maybe jazz, who knows. But I had a lot of fun, and I thought this was a big success, and we look forward to doing it again. For Rich Condon, our guest, for my co-host Matt Borders, I'm your host Pat McGuire. You're listening to the History Things podcast. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the History Things podcast. Follow the guys on Facebook and Instagram at the History Things podcast for all the latest news and exclusives. Make sure to also follow Pat and Matt on their social medias at History Things with Pat and at Matt Borders Books. Have a question, comment, or compliment for the show? Send us an email at historythingspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show.